bang this really hard. Just bang.
Like, just once?
No, a couple times. I'll get it. Thank you, Elizabeth. As much as I might like you to be my daughter, because you're just as cute as my daughter, you're not, but it's Bring Your Daughter to Work Day. And so this is Elizabeth. She's Jeff's daughter. Where did Jeff go? Oh, did you get a picture? And so she's a Republican for at least a minute today. And she's going to help us out a little bit today, too. Thank you. It's good to have you here. All right. So the chair is going to call up H.R. 4889 as amended by the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. Yep. And I asked the clerk to, and Elizabeth, you're going to go down and sit down with, oh, you're going to sit here? Okay. Ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 4889, to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to require providers of a covered service to provide call location information concerning the telecommunications device of a user of such service to an investigative or law enforcement officer in an emergency situation involving risk of death or serious physical injury, or in order to respond to the user's call for emergency services.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk. It's hold harmless-01.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4889, offered by Mr. Walden.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment. And the gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment inserts a small technical change to make the liability protection in the bill consistent with that adopted in previous iterations and at the state level in multiple states. It's a change that we've discussed with our minority colleagues and accurately reflects our agreement on the hold harmless provision, and so I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment. In addition, Mr. Chairman, I have a number of letters in support of the Kelsey-Smith Act that I'd like to ask unanimous consent be entered into the record.
Without objection.
And with that, I would call on my colleagues to support the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none? Oh, gentleman from Texas.
And I'll be brief, Mr. Chairman. I had informed my staff to inform your staff and the subcommittee staff that I would oppose this bill today. My legislative director did an unusual thing. She asked me to read the bill, and I did read the bill. And when I read the bill, I realized that it was only if somebody made a 911 call requesting assistance. So that obviously if you're making a 911 call, you want the law enforcement people to know where you are. You want them to get to you. And so I want to apologize to you and your staff because yesterday afternoon we burned up the lines trying to figure out a way for me to offer some amendments. But when I actually sat down and read the bill, I am now totally supportive of the bill.
Well, knowing that you're an engineer from A&M, I'm glad that you read it.
So I am open-minded enough on occasion to do the right thing and to read this, and this is a good piece of legislation, so I support it. And I support the manager's amendment.
Right. Thank you. Gentleman yields back his time. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment by the gentleman from Oregon? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion share of the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentleman from New Jersey has an amendment at the desk. And the clerk will report 01. The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4889, offered by Mr. Pallone.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment. And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last Congress, the committee considered another version of the Kelsey-Smith Act and voted that bill out of committee on a voice vote. But we're not considering that version today. Today, the bill before us does not follow the framework in that compromise. H.R. 4889 disregards this committee's hard work on the Kelsey-Smith Act. When the committee first considered the Kelsey-Smith Act, it had concerns about the bill's potential risks to consumers' privacy and Fourth Amendment rights, and the committee worked together in a bipartisan way to address some of these concerns and favorably reported the Kelsey-Smith Act to the floor. This amendment would offer another opportunity to take up the compromise that was worked out last Congress, and the amendment requires that 48 hours after law enforcement makes an emergency request, that the officer making that request seek a court order stating whether he or she has probable cause to believe that there was in fact an emergency. As a result, the amendment addresses some of the concerns that civil liberties groups have raised regarding potential abuse in H.R. 4889, while also ensuring that law enforcement have quick access to life-saving location data when they're presented with an emergency situation. So I just wanted to stress again, Mr. Chairman, that nothing in my amendment would stop law enforcement from acting swiftly to get the accurate location data needed to respond to life-threatening emergencies. That's a goal that we all agree on. But at the subcommittee markup last week, concerns were raised about the impact my amendment would have on existing state laws, and I heard those concerns and have modified my amendment to include a savings clause to address that issue. So essentially, if states want to be more restrictive or less restrictive, they can. And again, you understand that if it's a situation where they had an emergency, they went and got the information, and then they showed later that they did not have probable cause, that doesn't preclude the information from being used. This is just a way of providing some privacy and Fourth Amendment rights without in any way limiting the ability to get the information in an emergency. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak?
Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman.
from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you,
for 5
Mr.
minutes.
Chairman. I appreciate that. I understand the concerns regarding privacy, and I believe this bill strikes the right balance between safeguarding privacy and giving law enforcement the tools to save lives in an emergency. Let me explain why. The circumstances where it applies are very narrow. Only when the officers reasonably believe that there is substantial risk of death or serious physical harm. The data are accessible only very narrowly, only the location data of the device. This does not allow any access to data on the device, call records, text messages, emails, pictures, or any other personal data. All that's off limits. It simply pertains to the routine contact between the device and the cell tower. So these are very targeted and very narrow and very specific parameters that will significantly limit and prevent overuse or abuse of this legislation. Now, states have the discretion to adopt additional protections if they so wish. We allow that here. We do not preempt that ability. However, several of the states that have adopted the Kelsey-Smith Act do not contain the additional requirements that the minority is requesting, and we believe we should not overrule the will of the states that have already made that decision, as Oregon has. This approach allows those states to keep their current law, but does not prevent states that wish to adopt more stringent requirements for their officers from doing so. So the states can still adopt rules for law enforcement to follow when obtaining the data, whether it's sworn statement or after the fact judicial approval of the request. Consequences already exist. They already exist for law enforcement officers who don't tell the truth or misrepresent circumstances to gain access to information. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I reluctantly must oppose the gentleman's amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak in favor of the Pallone amendment. I believe that law enforcement deserves timely access to cell phone location data. In this day and age, people are more likely to have their cell phones on them than their wallets. And in emergency situations, I agree that this can really be the difference between life and death. However, I also believe that it's incumbent upon us to ensure that there's proper procedures in place to ensure this information is not abused. I agree with many that say location data reveals a great deal about our personal lives and should be protected. This bill as drafted lacks critical safeguards to ensure that law enforcement does not abuse the privilege Congress is granting them. I supported the bipartisan version of this bill that we voted out of committee last year. But I have to tell you, I have serious reservations about advancing this bill as is and urge the chairman to work with us before this bill goes to the floor to come up with a compromise that balances our public safety while protecting America's privacy. We heard at the hearing when we asked the gentleman in charge of Fairfax 911 if he had any objections to after the fact notification, so that a person knows that if their location data has been revealed, that they're notified of this, so that they know someone has done that, and if there was no reason for that to be done, that there's some recourse for them. We also asked that gentleman from Fairfax 911 if he had any problem with after the fact certifying that this was really an emergency. In both of those instances, he said that wasn't a problem as far as he was concerned. We all want to pass this bill and provide this life-saving information for the families. So there's no argument about that. We're all in agreement about that. But I do think this becomes a much better bill when it addresses the privacy concerns after the fact, after we do the location data, and adds the critical safeguards to make sure that people's privacy is protected. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope we can work together between now and when the bill goes to the floor, and I thank you for the time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members? Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaking to the amendment, Mr. Chairman, I think I'm going to oppose the amendment, but I do think there's at least one point in there that we ought to take a look at, and that is the paragraph dealing with form of request. As the bill currently reads, the request theoretically could be an oral request. In an emergency, you may want to do that, but I do think at some point there needs to be a written statement as to why you believe that there is an emergency situation. I think we can work on language to do that, particularly for those areas that we have jurisdiction over. I would also point out that one of my problems with the bill, and we may have passed it last year, and I regret that I didn't read it more carefully last year, but when you start looking at the court order section, 48 hours may be good for Fairfax. As the gentleman just said, Fairfax 911 said they didn't have a problem with it. But if you're in the rural part of the country, the court of competent jurisdiction may not be there. Also, our paragraph doesn't say anything about which court. Obviously, we wouldn't want to have a bankruptcy court saying, oh, yeah, that's fine. It needs to be a court of competent jurisdiction. So I have to oppose the amendment, but I do think that it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a sworn written statement. I don't care if it's electronic, so that there's at least a record every time an officer makes such a request, that there's a record of it, so that later, if you do have a civil liberties violation, which there are plenty of protections, Mr. Walden was absolutely correct on that, if somebody abuses it, but it's nice to have a clear record as opposed to merely an oral statement. So I'm opposed to the amendment, but I do hope that we will continue to work to see if maybe we can figure out a way to have that written statement portion provided in our final bill. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Further members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4889 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair will now call up H.R. 4167 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 4167, to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to require multi-line telephone systems to have a default configuration that permits users to directly initiate a call to 911 without dialing any additional digit, code, prefix, or postfix, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill?
Yes, right.
Are there any amendments to the bill? The gentleman from Oregon is recognized to offer an amendment.
I do have a bipartisan amendment with Ms. Eshu at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4167, offered by Mr. Walden and Ms. Eshu.
And without objection, the amendment, the bill is considered as read, and the gentleman from Oregon is recognized with the gentlelady from California, each for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank my colleague from California, Ms. Eshu, who's been terrific to work with on this amendment and on other issues. I appreciate that. I think this bill really comes about from a very, very tragic situation where we were shocked to hear in the testimony about a young girl who was in a hotel room with her parents and her estranged, her father, who was estranged from the wife, ended up stabbing and murdering the mother. She dialed 911 repeatedly to try and get help, and tragically, it didn't work, because you have to dial 9 before 911 in some locations, including the hotel where they were. Her mother died. She witnessed it, and her father told us in the testimony that how hard it was to have her sit on his lap, I believe, at the police station, where she said, "Papa, I tried." You see, most of us teach our kids to dial 911, not 911 or some other prefix. And out of this terrible tragedy comes this legislation, because it turns out in most systems that we're affecting here today, it's a simple reprogramming. That's all you have to do. And then 9 works, 911. And so, Mr. Chairman, this legislation is important. Many states have adopted it. This gives us a national standard. And again, I thank my colleague from California for her help on this, and I would be happy to yield time to her if she would like to do it that way, or I will encourage my colleagues to support the bipartisan amendment and yield back. So, Ms. Eshu, may I yield you time on this?
I thank you for yielding time to me, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be a co-sponsor of this amendment. It clarifies the bill, and it also covers installers and operators of multi-line telephone systems in addition to manufacturers. These are good changes, and I know that most of the members probably don't know what we're talking about, but I think that it improves the bill, and I'm pleased that the changes are really going to further the goal of enabling direct dialing to 911 on these systems. I hope everyone understands that these multi-line telephone systems are exactly what we have on our desks in our offices. So that's why it's so important. It really covers a very large space in what we're talking about. And I appreciate the bipartisan way the majority has worked with me and my staff to make sure these changes were made. And so I think between Mr. Walden and myself, we all urge you to support this, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
I thank the gentlelady, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time and encourage my colleagues to support the bipartisan amendment.
Are there, gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment?
I have
Did you want?
I have an amendment.
Oh, wait, we got to
in the second
dispense with,
degree?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, an amendment to the amendment? The gentlelady has an amendment to the amendment, so clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment offered by Ms. Eshu.
And without objection, the amendment to the amendment is considered as read, and the staff will distribute the amendment to the amendment, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is really a very simple one, and I think a very important one. It requires the FCC to commence a proceeding on location accuracy for multi-line telephone systems within 180 days of the bill's enactment. As the co-chair of the Next Gen 9/11 caucus, I think we need to take advantage of this opportunity to make location accuracy a standard feature in all multi-line telephone systems. When someone dials 911, first responders need to know where the individual is calling from. They need to do that by directly dialing 911, and we're curing any prefix to that. But especially if the caller is in a large building and is unable to communicate to the dispatcher, exactly where they are, or they simply don't know exactly where they are calling from. In an emergency, we all know that seconds matter, minutes matter. And if first responders have to spend time searching buildings or going door to door, that really can make a difference between life or death. And that has happened in our country. This isn't something that, that is made up. It's an issue that the FCC has been studying since 1994. That's 22 years. I think it's about time that we do something very positive about this and not keep on kicking the can down the road. I know that colleagues on both sides of the aisle care about this. Unfortunately, we couldn't come. I thought we were going to come to an agreement, Mr. Shimkus and myself. But I don't think that the notice of inquiry moves the ball forward. In fact, it's Pete and repeat. And that view is shared by the FCC and, very importantly, the public safety community. In 2012, Congress directed the FCC to issue a public notice seeking comment on the feasibility of multi-line telephone systems to provide the precise location of a 911 caller. It was included in Section 6504B of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012, and it was modeled on legislation that I introduced with Mr. Shimkus, known as the Next Generation 911 Advancement Act of 2012. So I also would like to ask Mr. Chairman for unanimous consent that the FCC's 2012 public notice on location accuracy be placed into the record, and I think by doing so we'll refresh the record on an FCC docket that is decades old. So I
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said earlier, the amendment is a simple one, and it says nothing about what the proceeding at the FCC should look at and what the FCC would require. In fact, if the FCC chooses to first conduct an NOI before proposing rules, it could do so under my amendment. And I think that's where we have at least some common ground, Mr. Shimkus and I. So obviously, I don't think the status quo is defensible here. I think over 2 decades of kicking this issue around, that we should take action. I want to remind my colleagues that the National Emergency Number Association, called NENA, many of you have been to their receptions, recently proposed model legislation for Congress to enact to ensure that all multi-line telephone systems can provide a caller's location in the event of an emergency. And this legislation was proposed during NENA's 911 Goes to Washington fly-in February of this year. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, which will bring us one step closer to finishing the work that began 22 years ago. I believe that it has the potential to save lives and protect the public, which is one of the basic responsibilities that we have. Let's see. I have 23 seconds if anyone would like me to yield to them. Otherwise, I will yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair to recognize Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, there's no one that I work closer with probably on this full committee than is with Congressman Eshoo. And so I don't question her commitment to the 911 cause or the policy itself. You know, this whole story and this law that's being proposed, the bill being proposed, hopefully will be signed into law, was, you know, brought to us by, of all people, Louis Gohmert, who, you know, this happened in his district and to a constituent. So the point being this: we know, as Chairman Walden said, that doing the 911 is a simple programming change. We don't know if identification, location, and multi-line systems is as simple. And yeah, there's some of us who are skeptical of the, I know it's hard to believe, skeptical on the FCC on in proposed rulemaking. And so we don't have as great a confidence in the FCC as some folks on the other side do. So in our attempt to try to find a middle ground, let's do the inquiry, let's do the investigation, let's see what's needed. It could be very, very simple. Unfortunately, that was rejected, and we're at the point now that I will ask my colleagues to vote against my colleague's amendment so that we can move this bill forward to the House floor and get it to the President's desk. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time. I'd be happy to yield.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I would only pose one question here, because I don't think anyone here disputes that location accuracy and location technology is an essential part of public safety with first responders. How are we going to get there if we only instruct the FCC to do an NOI? They already did. And so it's kind of like repeat and repeat. And I say this very sincerely. I mean, what are the steps that you envision in order to get there?
Well, again, if you were claiming my time, the NOI was conducted years ago. A lot has changed in the communication world since then. And I guess you have to have an appreciation that many of us are skeptical on the FCC and proposed rulemaking. And we're concerned about what burden might be placed onto the smaller systems that have multi-line systems but are small businesses, not knowing if it's an easy technological fix or a more challenging one that's costly. And that's why our response was to do an inquiry to find out those facts. That was rejected, so we're not prepared, I think. I haven't whipped my colleagues, but I don't think we're prepared to accept a possible additional burden. What we did in the 911 caucus was a great compromise, trying to make sure that all the stakeholders, not just public safety, but the telecommunications companies, the cell companies, in essence, the hardline companies, that they were all working together. And that finely tuned balance helped us to move great public policy forward. This was not worked originally in that mode. The original amendment was brought forward, by yourself. And we countered with the inquiry and hoping that would at least keep us united. That did not happen, and so we are where we are. We'll cast our votes and we'll move forward.
Would you yield?
I would be happy to yield.
Nothing in my amendment opposes the FCC doing exactly what you would like them to do, but it stops there. It stops there, and once that notice of information and inquiry is updated, we need in our country to proceed with and do the due diligence. This committee can't do it. We're not technologists here. We're not engineers. Maybe there are some, but it's not up to us to do it. That the FCC can do the work that is necessary to get to location location accuracy and a standard feature for multi-line telephone systems. But I appreciate you yielding to me, Mr. Chairman, and I think my amendment is a step into the future to get there. The gentleman's from Illinois is to just do the NOI. I agree we need to do that, but I think that we need to take the next step as well. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, we all want to step forward on this issue. It's a question of, do you step into something or do you step forward? We think an NOI makes the most sense to gather information so at least you know what questions to ask. And the FCC, and this is a pretty activist FCC, can on its own order move forward on an NPRM. Notice proposed rulemaking. There's nothing we're doing here that precludes that. It's just if we're going to go down a path, we think gathering the information first, allowing the public to have a say and weigh in will enlighten the FCC. And so that's why, unfortunately, we're at this juncture where we're going to have to oppose my friend's amendment, secondary amendment, because to us it makes sense to do the NOI, not go directly to an NPRM. We couldn't reach agreement on that point, which brings us to this impasse. But a lot has happened in 4 years with technology. Yeah, this is such an evolutionary time in which we live when it comes to innovation, new technology. For the life of me, I don't understand why we wouldn't start by having the FCC gather information from the world's smartest people, and then they can go forward with an NPRM. Skipping that step, I think, doesn't lead to the best policy outcome. With that, I urge my colleagues to join in opposing the secondary amendment, and I yield back the balance of my
Would the
time.
gentleman yield?
Sure.
Thank you. I'm not opposed to what you want to do. It's included in my amendment, the NOI, that the FCC do the NOI. But in this case, the opposite of what you are worried about relative to the FCC being an activist agency, they've done the opposite here. They have kicked this ball down the road for 22 years. And that's why I think Congress should instruct them to not only do the NOI, but to, once they gather that information, this is where we agree, do the NOI, see what that produces, it's fresh, the record will be refreshed, what technologies are out there, how to do it, and then to take steps according to what they have gathered in the NOI to make headway on location technology. That's what the amendment is. So I appreciate the gentleman stating what he said.
In reclaiming my time, because actually your amendment says they can commence a proceeding. It doesn't require NOI. And what we're suggesting, because of that vagueness, the FCC could skip the NOI and just go right to an NPRM. So your amendment.
Yield for just
Sure.
10 seconds?
Of course.
Yeah, no, I want the FCC to move because they haven't moved. You're
Right.
suspects that they...
But you can't, reclaiming my time, you can't have it both ways. You want them to move. My sense is you want them to go right to an NPRM, correct?
No, they can do the NOI. I'm for that. There's nothing in my amendment that precludes that. But I also want them, once they've done the NOI, per your description, that they then move past where they've been stuck for 22 years. They haven't done what they should do. And that's, I think there's a hole in our public safety system because we haven't addressed this.
In reclaiming my time, I don't think we have disagreement on the latter part. I think this is something we can find common ground on, perhaps in a separate bill, and would be happy to continue this discussion there, not hold up this one. And so the gentlelady wants to withdraw her secondary amendment. That might make for best comment.
Well, I'll withdraw the amendment if we come up with, or you're committed to working on location technology.
In a separate bill.
Get the FCC going on this.
Yeah. I think we could find common ground on that issue.
Well,
in a separate, not attached to this necessarily.
I understand.
Okay, yeah.
All right, I'll withdraw on that solid commitment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady withdraws her amendment. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon. All those in favor, and SU, California, it's a bipartisan amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4167 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. I appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair now calls up 4111 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4111, to include skilled nursing facilities as a type of healthcare provider under Section 254H of the Communications Act of 1934.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? The Chair will recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance. As an amendment at the desk?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, there is a technical amendment, bipartisan in nature, related to the effective date.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4111, offered by Mr. Lance and Mr. Loebsack.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment. And the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill relates to expanding the statutory definition of healthcare provider under Section 254 of the Act to include skilled nursing facilities. As a result, such facilities will be eligible support under the program. It's clear beyond dispute that skilled nurses provide the same post-acute services that are traditionally provided at hospitals. This will be extremely beneficial to rural America, and of course it's the charge of this committee to improve the health of the entire American nation, including rural America. And I'm very grateful to Congressman Loebsack and Congressman Kramer for their hard work in this area, and I certainly would yield time to Congressman Loebsack.
Thank you, Mr. Lance. I really appreciate the opportunity to work with you on this and work with Mr. Kramer as well. I think you've said it all. This is great for rural America. It's going to, obviously, it's going to allow skilled nursing facilities to be eligible for universal service funding through the rural health care program. And the amendment is a technical fix. I support that as well, and I'd be happy to yield back. Thank you, Mr. Lance.
Thank you, and I certainly yield to my colleague, Congressman Kramer.
Thank you, Representative Lance and Representative Loebsack, for including me and for your good work on it as well. I think it would be hard to overstate the importance of the ability for rural health care facilities, especially skilled nursing facilities, to have access to this type, these funds to create this type of opportunity. The opportunity that technology provides to provide greater access to patients in rural America, especially at skilled nursing facilities, adds to quality of life. It actually scores favorably. It actually can prevent greater health care problems, which of course even saves more money. And it's just a pleasure to be part of something that's this positive, and I appreciate my colleagues' work on it.
Thank you, Congressman, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey and Iowa. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4111 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. And the bill is favorably reported. Chair will now call up H.R. 4190 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 4190, to promote innovation, investment, and economic growth by accelerating spectrum efficiency through a challenge prize competition.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be opened up for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote occurs.
Mr. Chairman,
Oh,
may I
sorry.
strike the last word to speak?
Gentlelady
on
is
the bill?
recognized for 5 minutes. Strike
Thank
the last.
you. I'm pleased that this committee is considering my legislation today, H.R. 4190, the Spectrum Challenge Prize Act. Spectrum is invisible infrastructure that supports our wireless economy, but unlike bridges or railroads, we can't go out and build more spectrum. As more and more products and services use wireless connectivity, the efficient use of spectrum will be critical to our continued global leadership in the technology sector. That's why I've worked with my colleague, Representative Guthrie, on legislation that encourages the efficient management of spectrum by the federal government. Improving the ways in which we manage spectrum at the federal level is important, but that progress must be paired with greater technological efficiencies. My Spectrum Challenge Prize legislation, which I introduced with Senator Tom Udall, would encourage wireless innovation by creating a federal Spectrum Challenge Prize. The Challenge Prize competition would help incentivize innovators and entrepreneurs to develop technologies that eclipse the current state of art and promote the efficient use of spectrum. Challenge prizes have a long track record of spurring innovation, including designing a glove used by astronauts, flying a lunar lander, and driverless car technology. The Spectrum Challenge Prize Act creates a new opportunity for the federal government and the private sector to work collaboratively in the pursuit of a spectrum efficiency breakthrough, which is ultimately a victory for American consumers. Because spectrum is a finite resource, the growth of our wireless economy will require efficiency at every level, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 4190, the Spectrum Challenge Prize Act. Thank you.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I certainly do yield.
I thank the gentlelady, and I just want to say we really appreciate your leadership on this and other communications issues, and I commend you for the great work that you and Congressman Guthrie have done as part of our Spectrum Working Group. This is an innovative approach to addressing the problem of how we deal with increasing demand for spectrum. It's good to work with you. I encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 4190.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the bill or offer an amendment? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4190 to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And the bill is favorably reported. Chair now calls up H.R. 3998 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3998, to direct the Federal Communications Commission to commence proceedings related to the resiliency of critical telecommunication networks during times of emergency and for other purposes.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Chair would recognize the gentleman from New Jersey who has an amendment, Mr. Pallone, who has an amendment at the desk. Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3998, offered by Mr. Pallone.
And without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Superstorm Sandy had a devastating impact on my district back in New Jersey and throughout the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area. And in response to it, I introduced the Sandy Act, or Securing Access to Networks and Disasters Act, to address the lessons we learned in the aftermath of that terrible storm. The legislation incorporated feedback that I heard from local officials and industry leaders at a forum on Sandy, where we took a critical look at the lessons learned and the progress made with public safety telecommunications since the hurricane. At the same time, I was working with FCC Chairman Wheeler and the wireless industry to make sure we're better prepared. And now I want to say that we reached an agreement to ensure that consumers have greater access to communications the next time disaster strikes. Yesterday, with CTIA, we announced the Wireless Network Resiliency Framework, under which the largest wireless providers will voluntarily comply with the wireless provisions set forth in the Sandy Act. And the framework makes sure that if one network goes down, its customers can access another network that is still operational. And everyone should be able to call for help as long as any signal is available. The agreement also takes action on other issues raised by the Sandy Act, such as making sure public safety officials and wireless personnel know how to reach each other at a moment's notice during an emergency. And this agreement will save lives during major emergencies in the future. And I want to thank the wireless carriers and the FCC for working with me to craft this comprehensive agreement. In light of that agreement, I'm offering an amendment today in the bill that will remove the wireless provisions from the Sandy Act. And since this framework is voluntary, I look forward to continuous updates from the industry on the progress they're making to meet everything included in this agreement. Again, this agreement is a major step, but more needs to be done, and we have to learn all the lessons from disasters like Sandy. For instance, in New Jersey, broadcasters and cable providers saved thousands of lives even before the storm hit. They provided the critical information that let people know how to get out of harm's way. And public safety officials have told me that without this information, the death toll would have been much, much worse. But to keep this information flowing when the power goes out, the networks need backup generators, and those generators need fuel. Unfortunately, broadcasters, cable operators, and telecommunication providers have struggled in emergencies to find this fuel, and oftentimes when they finally find it, they're sent to the back of the line. Worse, once they get the fuel they need, it can be confiscated in favor of other services considered more essential under the law. But fuel is not the only issue. In the chaos that follows a major disaster, just getting access to secure areas can be trying. During Sandy, communication providers were turned away at bridges because, once again, they were not considered essential. And these are the providers that make sure we can call 911 or can contact loved ones. It took days to get some networks back online simply because we could not get the right people to the right places. So my bill attempts to fix these problems and more. It would recognize the life-saving role played by wireline and mobile telephones, internet, radio and television broadcasting, and cable and satellite services by adding them to the list of essential service providers. Having these networks operational can mean the difference between life and death during an event like Superstorm Sandy. So I want to thank Chairman Upton, Chairman Walden for considering this bill, and I'd like to also thank them both for their input on the amendment I'm offering. This amendment would refocus the Sandy Act on the critical work that still remains to be done, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sure.
I'd just like to commend the gentleman for his work on this very important legislation. And, you know, it's so important to make sure that our communications companies can actually enter into a disaster area to restore service. Heretofore, the underlying statute simply said if you're a telephone company, you can. Well, we've changed a lot since then. And so this is good legislation, good work of the committee, and I commend the gentleman and appreciate his leadership on this and encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 3998 and the amendment to it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your support, Congressman. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Chairman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey? Seeing none, the vote occurs on that amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 3998 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair now will call up H.R. 2031 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 2031, to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to provide for enhanced penalties for the transmission of misleading or inaccurate caller identification information with the intent to trigger a response by law enforcement agencies.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment. My amendment would make an important technical adjustment to the Anti-Swatting Act. Swatters.
Let me ask the clerk to report the title of the amendment.
Okay.
Amendment to H.R. 2031 offered by Mr. Engel.
And without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I just mentioned, this amendment, I believe, would make an important technical adjustment to the Anti-Swatting Act. Swatters across the country have reported different types of phony emergencies. These false reports have prompted responses not just from police departments, but from fire, EMS, and rescue services as well. Swatting has also impacted 911 public safety answering points, which spend valuable time and resources handling swatting calls and dispatching a response. So my amendment would simply make clear that falsifying your caller ID information to mislead any and all of these entities, not solely police departments, is prohibited, and that swatters must reimburse any and all of these entities for their expenses in responding to a fraudulent call. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, another great piece of legislation to address an emerging problem. I commend my colleague from New York for his leadership on this. And this is really important to our first responders and to people who are in emergency situations whose service may actually be delayed because the responders out taking care of somebody that they never should have gone to. So, Mr. Engel, thank you. And I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment and passage of the bill. It's Mr. Engel's time. Mr. Engel, I believe Mr. Kinzinger wanted to make a comment.
Will gentleman yield this time? Or is it?
Yeah. Yes, I certainly yield.
Well, I just want to commend you also on your work on this. I mentioned in opening statements, I'm a victim of swatting. Actually locally, and this was a few years ago, but it tied up a lot of resources from our local officers and responders. Somebody had basically called 911 and claimed that they were being held hostage, and you would imagine the response that comes from that. So it was not pleasant to get woken up at 2:30 in the morning with that, and then it happened again a week later. So it's a problem that is real and emerging, and commend the gentleman on his work. It was Shimkus.
Okay, gentleman yields back.
I yield back.
And are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 2031 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. And the bill is favorably reported. Chair now will call up H.R. 2589 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 2589, to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to require the Federal Communications Commission to publish on its Internet website changes to the rules of the Commission no later than 24 hours after adoption.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is open for amendment at any point. Are there any amendments to the bill? The chair will recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina, Mrs. Elmers, for an amendment. Pardon? I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll come back to
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word to speak in support of the bill.
I'm sorry. Strike the last word or offer an amendment?
Strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill, H.R. 2589, would require the FCC to publish any changes in their rules on their website within 24 hours of adoption. My bill is a good government bill that would require the FCC to ensure that the public has timely access to the rules that will impact their everyday lives. As most of us remember, our current president called his administration, quote, the most transparent in history. However, currently, there are no rules surrounding the publication of rules after adoption, and staff at the FCC are routinely granted editorial privileges on the adopting order, which may draw out the process beyond what is reasonable. In our last hearing, the FCC Chairman Wheeler said that the FCC has the ability to comply with this legislation. These things considered, this bill represents a reasonable standard of transparency that everyone can agree to. The American people want an open and accountable government, and today we have an opportunity to take another step forward. I thank the committee for moving this legislation forward, and I look forward to seeing the final passage. I hope you can join me in ensuring that the public enjoys the right to speedy access to the FCC rules. I yield my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there further amendments to the bill? The chair would recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, who has an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 2589, offered by Mr. McNerney.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I thank the chairman. I want to commend my colleague, Ms. Elmers, on her efforts to improve the transparency. However, H.R. 2589 would have the effect of omitting crucial explanatory texts from rules published by the FCC. Separating the rules from the explanatory text could cause confusion and uncertainty about the meanings of the rules. Furthermore, such a process is inconsistent with Administrative Procedure Act, which requires any rule or changes to be accompanied by explanatory text. Clearly, the proposed legislation needs to be modified. Under my amendment, within 24 hours that the Secretary of the Commission receive dissenting statements from all the commissioners wishing to make dissenting statements, the FCC would have to post on its website in its entirety the rule and the explanatory text. This would strike an appropriate balance between the concerns raised by our colleague Ms. Elmers and the need to provide assurance that the Commission's decisions will be released as quickly as possible. I understand it can be frustrating to wait for a final text of decisions to be released, but it is appropriate to provide commissioners with time to finalize written statements after a vote. Nobody wants to write a statement in 2 minutes. You want to have time to think about your decision, write it down in a coherent way and submit it. So this basically gives the commissioners time to write their dissenting votes, and then within 24 hours, that has to be published. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I support Mr. McNerney's amendment to Ms. Elmer's bill. I think they're both advances in good public policy and more transparency in government, which the voters deserve and the taxpayers demand. And so I would encourage my colleagues to support Mr. McNerney's amendment and the underlying bill, and together we will make for a small step forward in improving the actions of the FCC and the transparency and timeliness of its efforts. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman and commend him for his efforts.
Thank you.
Thank you, and yes, if the gentleman will
yield
yield
to the
from California, I thank you for this amendment. I think this is a great way we can all work together at a better policy and an open and transparent government. And again, thank you for helping to make some of these things more clarified, because we want the American people to understand the situation. And if this is going to help, I'm more than happy to respond favorably.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time, I thank the gentlewoman and the gentleman from Oregon, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 2589 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair now calls up H.R. 2592 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 2592, to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to require the Federal Communications Commission to publish on the website of the Commission documents to be voted on by the Commission.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on, oh, I'm sorry, somebody. Yes. Did you want to say? Strike the last word? Gentlelady asked to strike the last word?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I have an amendment at the desk.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
The gentlelady from California has an amendment at the desk?
It's not an amendment? Oh, I just want to strike the last.
Strike the last word. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
On my brain. Mr. Chairman, I don't support this bill. And I think that it is a bill that, in fact, is being spoken of and referred to as a bill for transparency, which everybody loves transparency. There's nothing wrong with transparency. But when you peel back some of the language, what it does, in fact, is to throw enormous sand in the gears so that the FCC will never get anything done. And that is maybe the wish of some, but I think that we want transparency to make an agency more effective, more trustworthy, and all the things that come with transparency. Now, what the transparency is going to bring about is the so-called transparency. It's going to create an unending cycle of comments. So the chairperson of the commission has something that he or she wants to advance. That has to be posted before he or she meets with commissioners, and then there's a comment period. So this is Transparency for Lobbyists Act, or a Throw Sand in the Gears Act. This isn't anything that is going to make the commission work in a more meaningful way. I think it would result in a less meaningful review of items by the 4 commissioners of the commission. And the outcomes would just really produce a mess, in plain English. Now, we addressed this issue in the FCC Process Reform Act from the last Congress. It included a provision that would require the FCC to start a proceeding to determine whether to release draft items before the commission votes. That was a compromise, and the House passed this bill. Now, I don't know what the reasoning is for this piece of legislation, given what we did in the last Congress. Maybe it's, I don't know, is it to punish the FCC? I really don't know. I really don't know what the real intent of this is. And
will the gentlelady yield?
It's not an ad hominem attack on anyone. I'm talking strictly about, because I respect.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Just a minute, I'm not finished. And then I'd be happy to yield to my chairman. This is not good legislation. I think what we did in the last Congress made sense. And what this does, again, is there will be an unending cycle of comments. It has to be posted, then there are comments. Then they try to do something, it has to be posted, and there are comments. So that wheel will keep spinning, and if the ultimate goal is that the FCC never get anything done because you can't stand the FCC, just think of when you want the FCC to do something. There are members on both sides of the aisle that have directed the FCC to do things. Keep offices open, do the auction, whatever. So I think we have to think this thing through. And I don't think that this advances anything that is positive. With that, I'll yield to my chairman and my friend, Mr. Walden.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I couldn't disagree more. And there is precedent existing in the federal government today that proves every point she made is a parade of horribles that wouldn't happen. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission operates with almost an identical size, composition, budget, and statutory basis as the Federal Communications Commission. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, does really important work, releases its orders on the day of the vote, There's not sand in their gears.
Well, reclaiming my time, why is it that what we did in the last Congress doesn't address what is in this bill? We included a provision that would require the FCC to start a proceeding and determine whether to release draft items before the commission votes. Why is that not good enough? I mean, we supported it. It was a compromise, but we got that done. Why is that not good enough?
Mr. Chairman, I seek...
Gentlelady's time has expired. It would yield to the gentleman from Oregon asked for 5 minutes.
Well, let me go on my own time now. The Federal Trade Commission releases the actual text of rules before proceedings to a final decision pursuant to Federal Trade Commission Act 15 U.S.C. Section 57 of AB1A. So FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, a similarly sized, situated, and commission of similar importance, can release its orders on the same day. They make it work. Federal Trade Commission does really critical work. They're calling Mr. Whitfield right now. They release their text of rules before proceeding to a final decision. So they're even a little ahead. The release of the text of rules does not trigger an additional comment cycle. We've checked with administrative law experts. They believe this bill would not trigger a new comment cycle if the FCC is following current procedures. This is all, the notion that somehow everything's going to grind to a halt and this is an anti-FCC thing, it is neither of those. It is a pro-open government thing. That's what we're about here, is to make sure that those who have an interest in these issues better see what the commission, Federal Communications Commission, is up to. We patterned this after what Federal Energy Regulatory Commission already does. Federal Trade Commission already does. We've worked with administrative law experts to make sure this is done correctly. This does not impact the FCC's ability to deliberate. If anything, it just holds commissioners accountable for the changes that are made to the document. Transparency and accountability to the public are a good thing. We should all be for that, and for the life of me, I can't understand
Would the
why
gentleman
we have this
yield?
division. I need to yield to my friend from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, whose bill it is.
I thank the gentleman, and I mean this is basic. We're not trying to slow down the FCC or do anything like that. It's just saying, look, right now the chairman can seek who he wants to release documents to and what part he wants to release. That's within his realm to do anyway. And so if you're against the release of these documents, period, the other side's argument should be putting forward a bill to block the FCC from ever releasing anything instead of being able to do it selectively. So I know, and do you mind if I ask the council just a very brief question? For council, from your opinion, would this bill as written lead to an endless round of comments?
No, I believe that the way that the bill is written, it would not lead to endless comments. The agency is only required to consider public comment and respond within reason. This would only be triggered if there are new or novel issues raised in the draft, the decision released by the chairman, which, assuming proper APA procedure is followed, that would not be the case.
Thank you. And we want this to run smooth and efficiently and transparently. That's all we seek to do here, very simply, and I yield the gentleman
Would
back.
the gentleman
Would the
yield?
Would
the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you. Isn't this structured so that it's 3 weeks in advance?
3 weeks.
Somebody want to answer that?
Yeah, it's within 24 hours of being circulated, or 21 days before.
It requires
Would the gentleman yield?
reclaiming my time. It requires the FCC to publish the text of the rules to be voted on at the time of circulation to the commissioners, or 21 days in advance of adoption if not released at circulation. Once again, this is about transparency.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I don't, in my opinion, this is not the same as what you cited for these other agencies. You're talking about draft orders, decisions that are being circulated. That's not the same as a final report or something that's going to be voted on immediately. It's very different. And it seems to me, I mean, what Ms. Escher was saying is pretty basic, which is that, if you're going to have to...
Reclaiming my time, would the gentleman then support posting the rules 24 hours after they voted on it?
My only point here is...
Before they vote on it?
Well, my understanding is that we have something similar to that we've all supported. You see, look, maybe I should take my own time.
Yeah, just reclaim my time.
Yeah, why don't you? Then I'll take my own.
Yeah, that's fine. Because if you want to do it so that 24 hours before they vote, it's kind of like our rules here in the committee require. And so the FTC actually releases the text of the rules before proceeding to a final decision. It works there. I mean, I think we could find common ground here, I would hope. That's why I'm so puzzled by the opposition. Now, I know that under the current FCC, a lot of the decision-making, they have to wait until the White House does a weekly radio report or something in order to know how to proceed. But with that, my time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other member, the chair would recognize the gentleman from New Jersey.
I'm not looking to, talk about this endlessly today, but I think the bottom line here is that, when is this timeline going to begin? Okay, I think Ms. Escher's point is that the way this Kinzinger bill is drafted, okay, you're now talking, in my opinion, you don't have to agree, at a much earlier stage. We're talking about draft documents that have to be reported not later than 24 hours after they've been circulated. I mean, this is not, in my opinion, very precise language, okay? And I think that what you're going to have is, okay, every time somebody at the FCC wants to take some action, has any kind of draft proposal, in other words, I'm sitting here at the FCC and I decide to take out a piece of paper and write this out, and this is now a draft, okay, that somehow that has to be reported within 24 hours. That's not the same as what you have to do with a final order or decision or report that we're going to have to vote on. And I think the point here is, I'm trying to be nice, is that it gives an opportunity for everybody on K Street to come in and say, oh, I don't like that draft, and maybe we should change it a little more here. And, you know, we can spend endless days to the point where where the FCC can't even operate effectively. Now, maybe that's not your intention. I'm not saying that you're trying to thwart the FCC or kill them or anything like that. Please don't misunderstand. But I think that we've got to understand that there's a timeline here. This is a much earlier stage with circulation of drafts than what you're talking about with some of the other agencies where they have to provide information for a final order. And if you want to sit down with us and discuss it further, that's fine, to make this more precise in the vein that, you know, we want to have more transparency. But this is much too early, too unclear, too imprecise, and I think the only consequence of it would be that they can't do anything, and every lobbyist is going to be talking about it every time they circulate a draft. I mean, if I'm sitting at the FCC and I write something by hand on a piece of paper, doesn't that qualify as a draft order that has, and then I circulate to my colleagues, doesn't that qualify as a draft order or report that I have been circulating under this bill? It seems to me it does. So, you know, that's not what we should be doing. Now, you may disagree, but that's how I interpret it. That's how I read this language.
Gentlemen,
yes.
I think it's important to note to members that when we took this issue up in the last Congress, we had a witness that walked through exactly what would take place as a result of this kind of language. So we were instructed in a very professional way what the outcome was. Now, if that's the outcome that the majority wants, as you said, then, you know, whatever we say is not going to get us to first base. But this is not thoughtful. It's not drawn well. You keep saying transparency. Everybody is for transparency. But if it only has transparency slapped at the top of it, and it has language that brings about something else at a very early stage, even the general counsel of the FCC, not that's probably a nail in our case, that the general counsel has said this is what described what the outcome would be. So we're for transparency. I'm not trying to throw sand in the gears. I grew up with transparency. I've lived with it. I've legislated it. I'm for it. We're all for it. But that's not what this language does. This thing is not ready for prime time. And I think Mr. Pallone is absolutely right. K Street will go crazy about this.
Will the gentleman yield?
They really will. The K Street will love it. Maybe it should be
Will the
called
gentleman yield?
K Street bill, because they can just keep saying we're going to comment. We're going to keep commenting early on. And so it'll just throw them into chaos. They won't be able to get anything done. And that's not good.
Yield?
It's not good for any of us. It's not good for the country. And it's...
Yeah, I mean, you can have the remainder of my time.
Thank you. I was just going to point out, we have heard from a lot of people on this. We've done our research. The GAO, Government Accountability Office, recommended in a 2009 report that the FCC publish actual language in the NPRM as a way to improve public participation in agency process. So I think more publication, more transparency, more ability for all the public, not just paid lobbyists, but everybody to have an idea is a good thing. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Move to strike. Last word. Let me just ask briefly, and unless somebody wants it after me on our side, I won't take all the time. I want to ask Ledge Council, there's been a lot of talk about timeline ambiguity, and do you think there's any timeline ambiguity in this?
The text of the bill requires the publication not later than 24 hours after the time the text is placed on circulation, or not later than 21 days before the date on which the vote is to occur. And in terms of when the text is placed on circulation, that term would be construed in light of how that is used under current commission practice.
I mean, it doesn't sound ambiguous to me. And, you know, again, the other point I want to reiterate is chairman of the FCC today can just say he wants to make things available or not, or who and what, and we just want to say we want to make it fair and for everybody. You know, if you're going to circulate these documents, we're not doing this for K Street or endless rounds of comments. It's just we want some transparency in this commission. Sure, you know, someday, yeah, this is going to be, you know, God willing, a commission where we have a majority of commissioners on it, but I also want them to be transparent. I want them to be able to circulate this kind of stuff and for people to be able to see what the FCC is discussing. So, you know, a lot of times we like to make a lot of things, I guess, controversial here. This is a pretty basic bill and something I hope and think we should adopt. And I would think the American people, if they're paying attention to this issue, would want it as well. So,
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I'm just going to make an analogy, and I don't want to. This is it. I'm done. But you know,
Me too.
What about here today? Okay, we come in here this morning, right, or yesterday, and we're negotiating between Democrats and Republicans different language on these bills, right? Some of it's handwritten, some of it's done, you know, the night before or even this morning. So what does that mean if we had some kind of language like this that applied to us? Every 10 minutes when I came up with a different amendment or different proposal to Fred, I would have to, you know,
I get your reclaiming my time, and I get the point. But let me just say, this bill that we're voting on right now has been public for a long time.
I
put it out
understand
there
that, but the
well,
point
it's
is,
my time. You know, the amendments we do, you know, they're out there on public. People can see it. We try to be transparent. So with that, you know, because going to endless, I can either yield or yield the time back.
Yeah, I'm done.
Would you yield?
I'll yield the time back. And
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Strike the last word.
5 minutes.
Thank you. Just a question to the Ledge Council that's in front of us right now. What my colleague just mentioned, Congressman Pallone, could this legislation actually trigger potentially endless question and answer, as was described, that maybe that could be the interpretation of what this legislation would do?
Sir, was that question for me?
Ledge Council.
Or for committee counsel?
Oh, committee counsel, I'm sorry.
According to the case law, unless the item that's released has new or novel issues in it, it would not require the FCC to respond to comments and therefore would not trigger additional rounds of comment. And assuming that the FCC has followed the proper administrative procedure, the document that's being released should not include new or novel information requiring those comments.
Okay, but once something is made public, doesn't anybody in the public space have the right to question whether or not there's new or novel information, et cetera, and therefore it would cause a quandary for the commission in having to determine whether or not that question was legitimate, and then they have to respond?
Under the APA, the way that the item would be considered, it would be reflective of the prior document, the notice of proposed rulemaking, et cetera, and should not include that information. That is something that the courts are able to decide ultimately, but the FCC's rules and the way that the APA is structured, that should not include that information.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Mexico would like to strike the last word.
Last word, Mr. Chairman. I won't take up all the time. Also, a question for council. This legislation, is this saying that these documents would be...
Is your mic on?
It is, Mr. Chairman. I'm just not near one. There we go. The legislation would make these documents, they turn them onto online public files. Is that what this would do?
It would require that the commission publish on the internet website the text of such an order.
So does that, so help me translate that, does that mean that they'd be online public files? Is that fair?
I don't believe so.
No?
I don't believe that's...
Oh, I'll just ask the other, if we want to, Josh wants to ask these.
No, I'm fine. I'm comfortable.
Or to the bill sponsor, so...
I'm comfortable with this one.
Are these, is this, if this goes on the website, what does that mean? That doesn't mean that they're an online public file? If it's an
online public
website by the FCC, I asked a question, are these going to turn into online public files? Your response was no. So how's the public going to get access to them?
I believe online public file, I'm assuming you're referring to the online public file used for broadcast purposes?
Anything. I think
So
every
online public
document-
file is a term, is a technical term in that context. And so, I mean,
What's
this,
an online public file? I can get the dictionary out again.
I don't have the FCC's definition, but they have specific requirements in their rules for an online
So
public file
the
by
way that
broadcast.
what an online public file is to me is that it's a file that's online that's available to the public. That seems like common sense.
Will the gentleman yield?
I gladly.
Yeah, I'm not an attorney, but I was a broadcaster, and a public file is what broadcasters are required by the FCC to keep. I think that's the confusion here, that unless you're in this business as you've been, I mean, as a PUC commissioner, that's a term of art, public file. I think that's this information would be online and available to the public.
Oh, so it's not an online public file, but it's a file available to the public that's online.
That's exactly right.
Oh.
Remember when we had this debate about is there a court case regarding, you know?
So it's not, again, it's not an online public file. It's a file available to the public online.
Correct.
And that's different?
Yes.
Would these documents be searchable by the public?
That is not required by this bill.
So how would they find them?
I think that
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Have you ever been on the FCC's website?
Yes.
Right. So this would be available on the FCC's website just like their other documents.
So when I go into the FCC's website, I can put in a few words in
Right.
their search engine.
However,
and that means that the documents that the FCC has are searchable, correct?
if the gentleman wants me to yield, I would tell
I'd be
you,
happy to yield.
first and foremost, the FCC's existing website stinks.
Yes.
And as a broadcaster, we could never find things through it. It needs a lot of repair, but that doesn't have anything to do with this. They could put it on the front page of their website. They could make it a lot better.
So I'm just trying to understand if the website stinks and we're not, and this committee refuses to help the FCC with funding to improve the website, we can't complain. It's happened. We voted on this thing, everybody. We had some legislation here. I can pull that up with Ledge Council as well. But with this legislation, how is the public supposed to search to find the documents? That's what I'm trying to get at here. Is it searchable? Can we find the documents? Mr. Chairman, anybody?
Oh, gentlemen, so you're saying we should fix the website before we make things
No,
available
that's not the
online?
point
I'm having a hard time tracking.
Adam, it's very
Fix the website. FCC, fix the website.
Yielding my time back. Adam, it's very simple, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Kinzinger. The idea here is that this legislation would make more documents available to the public. I'm trying to figure out if they're going to be available to the public online. Yeah,
Sure.
I hear yes. So how will the people find these documents?
If the gentleman will yield, maybe I suggest we pass this, get everything in order, and then we really encourage through a sense of Congress the FCC to fix their website so people can search things.
Yeah, but
Here, taking
gentleman
my time,
yield.
Here's the point that I'm trying to make. This last week on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, all of us as members of Congress had an opportunity to vote on a piece of legislation through an amendment that would have made documents that the FCC already has, that have already been paid for, fully searchable, fully identifiable, and made available and machine readable. And all but a handful of our colleagues voted no. So if we're truly going to try to make these documents available to the public, then let's work together in every step of the way on all those documents, especially where those no votes were cast on the online public files that are like the files that are public that are online. That's all I'm trying to say, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, sir.
Gentlemen's time has expired. I sense that the members are ready to vote on the bill. Recorded vote has been asked for. The question occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 2592 to the House. Roll call has been requested. All those in favor will vote aye, and those will be opposed will vote no, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes no. Ms. Clark. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Chairman Upton.
Votes aye. Other members wishing to vote? Ms. Kathy McMorris Rogers.
Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes aye.
How does Mr. Rush record it?
He is not recorded. Mr. Rush votes no.
Gentleman from
Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no.
other members wishing to cast a vote. Mr. Butterfield, were you recorded? He was recorded, right? Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 30 ayes and 22 noes.
30 ayes, 22 noes. The question on H.R. 2592, favorably reporting the bill, is adopted, and the bill is favorably reported. The chair now calls up H.R. 2593 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 2593, to amend the Communications Act of 1934.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? See, Mr. Cardenas, do you have an amendment to the bill?
Yes, thank you, Mr.
The clerk will
Chairman. I
report
have
the
an
title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2593, offered by Mr. Cardenas.
And without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment here, and Mr. Lara's bill would require that the FCC publish information on its horrible website 48 hours before making a decision on delegated authority. Delegated authority allows FCC bureaus and offices to make decisions so long as they aren't deciding novel legal issues. As a practical matter, delegated authority is used to conduct the routine business of the agencies, such as processing applications and issuing public notices. Thousands of these actions occur every year. These actions are not final until they are released by the FCC, and the FCC can decide not to take an action at any time before it releases the item. Adding a new notice requirement could have the perverse effect of slowing down the work of the FCC. As written, the bill could also create confusion and may cause unwarranted administrative burdens on the FCC when the agency is doing its routine work. Stakeholders could face uncertainty and longer wait times for previously routine decisions. That being said, transparency is an important goal of all of us and one that we all support. That's why I've offered my amendment to ensure there is more formalized transparency process when it comes to the Commission's use of delegated authority, while ensuring what we don't unnecessarily slow down the everyday work of the FCC. My amendment would give the FCC 270 days to complete a proceeding to create formal rules that will notify the public and other commissioners before an action is taken on delegated authority. I think this is a balanced approach to ensure that there is a formal process that will be more transparent but doesn't add an additional layer of bureaucracy that will slow down the FCC's work. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, strike the last word. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I introduced H.R. 2593 to increase transparency and accountability at the FCC. The legislation required the FCC to list and describe all items to be adopted on delegated authority 48 hours prior to action being taken if those items are given a delegated authority identification number. This will ensure that the Commission is appropriately delegating items and not passing decision-making to others in cases where items pose new and novel questions of policy. Those items should be considered and voted on by all the Commissioners. Additionally, the bill would remove suspicions of any misuse of delegated authority. It is also important to note that this requirement would not burden the Commission. The agency already produces this information after items are adopted. Therefore, the bill would merely shift timing and not increase workload. The intent of the legislation is to ensure transparency, not to create burdens. Furthermore, the agency would not be required to publish items that receive a delegated authority identification number, which only account for a small number of items. For example, in 2014, 1,845 items out of 950,000 received an identification number. It is my understanding that the numbers are given to items by the FCC bureau chiefs who consider whether the decision will have precedential value in the future and whether the item is an issue of broad public attention. I believe these items are the type of items that would be likely to receive a 48-hour notice. Lastly, I'd also like to offer a statement of support for H.R. 2593 from Commissioner O'Reilly. I quote, given my outspoken involvement in FCC process-related issues, I want to commend Congressman Latta's effort to bring the public into the loop on FCC decisions pushed to staff level. Notifying the American people of imminent staff decisions should be a basic priority. And with a Commission intent on avoiding accountability by delegating more and more important decisions to staff, from last year's wireless competition report to key policies on the incentive auction, Lifeline, and E-rate, it is more important than ever to shed more additional light on this process compared to the circulation time of items at the Commission level, during which the public has notice of the items as well as other descriptive materials. 48 hours is a very short time period, though the decisions can be just as consequential. The Commission is able to bypass quite a bit of public input through the abuse of delegated authority. It should not be permitted to bypass public notice as well. To be clear, nothing in the Latta bill will undermine the functionality of the Commission or the deliberative process. In fact, it will enhance its efforts and should be a welcome reform. And Mr. Chairman, if I could, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record Commissioner O'Reilly's statement, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would urge opposition to the bill offered by Mr. Latta. Delegated authority is overwhelmingly used to conduct routine business or routine agency business like application processing and issuing public notices. Last year, there were over 950,000 actions taken on delegated authority. And these actions are not final until they're released by the FCC, and the FCC can decide not to take an action at any time before it releases the item. And this bill would artificially delay thousands of routine and non-controversial items that the FCC processes annually. Requiring the FCC to post a description of all potential actions before they are finalized could create confusion by generating public lists of actions the agency may not actually take. And the bill would dramatically reduce productivity at the agency and would create uncertainty and longer wait times for applicants and license for what previously had been routine decisions. And I just think telling the FCC to wait 48 extra hours to release decisions that already have been made would do nothing to enhance transparency. I favor the substitute approach taken by Mr. Cardenas's amendment, which I think would correct the problems that we have with this bill. So I would urge my colleagues to vote for the Cardenas amendment, and if it doesn't pass, to vote against the bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Cardenas from California. Those in favor, roll call vote is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus.
Shimkus.
Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman
Other
Upton.
members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Pitts.
Mr. Pitts votes no.
Mr. Butterfield.
Mr. Butterfield votes aye.
Other members? Ms. Schakowsky.
Ms. Schakowsky votes aye.
Ms. Blackburn.
Ms. Blackburn votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 22 ayes and 29 noes.
22 ayes, 29 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 2593 to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. The chair now calls up H.R. 4586 as amended by the Subcommittee on Health and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4586, to amend the Public Health Service Act.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any amendments to the bill? The chair would recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, to offer an amendment. or is it Mr. Pitts? I'm sorry, Mr. Pitts, I saw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 4586, offered by Mr. Pitts.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an amendment that I think we can label as a bipartisan amendment. I'll let Mr. Green speak to that. The bill makes a technical correction to the placement of the grant program within the Public Health Service Act. It also changes the authorization of the program, brings the legislation into compliance with Cut-Go, and with this amendment we are repurposing authorizations to help fight the opioid epidemic. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment so that we can report this bill to the floor while being fiscally responsible. And does the gentleman, Mr. Green, seek recognition?
Mr. Green? No.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Pitts. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4586 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair now calls up H.R. 3680 as amended by the Subcommittee on Health and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3680.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized. As an amendment at the desk?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3680, offered by Mr. Pitts.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment. And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment does three important things. First, it corrects some important terminology in the bill. Secondly, it sets the authorization level to $5 million total for the period of fiscal years 2017 through 2021. Thirdly, the amendment makes the legislation Cut-Go compliant by reducing authorizations in the 319D of the Public Health Service Act. The amendment essentially repurposes funding so we can prioritize resources to fight the opioid epidemic. And with this amendment, we will be able to move the bill in a fiscally responsible way that is in line with the rules of the House, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman. I think he's presented the technical corrections that are being presented to the bill, which is a bipartisan bill. Presented those accurately. We had a good discussion of this in the markup at the subcommittee level. It'll be very effective, I think, in addressing the opioid crisis that we're facing in our country, and I urge support of the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Pitts. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Being chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 3680 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it, and the bill is favorably reported. The last bill of the markup. Chair now calls up H.R. 3691 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3691.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments? The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized. Has an amendment at the desk?
Yes, Mr.
Clerk will
Speaker,
report the title
Mr.
of the
Chairman,
amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3691, offered by Mr. Pitts.
And without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. This amendment makes one technical correction to the bill. and makes the legislation cut-go compliant. This program currently receives $15.9 million. This amendment would bring the authorization in the bill closer in line with this level to help ensure cut-go compliance. We have also increased the authorization to put more resources in the program and included offsets from Section 319D of the Public Health Service Act. The amendment essentially repurposes an authorization to help fight the opioid epidemic. And we're reauthorizing this important program in a way that is fiscally compliant. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair to recognize Mr. Green from Texas. Speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word. I support the amendment to expand the authorization of this important grant program. The Pregnant and Postpartum Women's Grant Program is an example of a program that's working but should be expanded to better meet the needs of pregnant and postpartum women. But I have to be honest, as the authorizing committee with jurisdiction over most of our nation's public health and healthcare system, cut-go has proven time and again to hamper our ability to respond to public health challenges. Today we're here to address one of the great challenges facing our community, neighbors, and our children, the heroin and opioid epidemic. And we all agree on the urgency of this epidemic. We sat in this room together yesterday with broad bipartisan support. We passed 8 bills in the fight against heroin and opioid abuse, and today we passed 3 more important bills. No one in this room believes that this issue isn't a problem. We all agree that it's an issue of top priority for our committee. But the reality is, even finding a few $1 million in funding authorizations to support these bipartisan efforts was a huge challenge due to the constraints of cut-go. This is because cut-go has created an impossible system where you have to choose between critically important and competing priorities. We all sit today as members of the United States House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee. We are charged with authorizing discretionary programs that can be considered for funding during the annual appropriations process. Every one of our constituents demand that we respond to public health challenges as they arise. Why should we continue to handicap our ability to respond to public health crises because of a rigid, inflexible cut-go rule? Let's not forget, cut-go isn't a law. It's a bureaucratic rule created by our House Republican colleagues. The American people don't want us to choose one disease over another. They want us to provide the necessary investments to respond to current public health challenges, ensure that we stop epidemics in their tracks, and prevent disease outbreaks from emerging again. We will be lying to ourselves and our constituents if we act as though we can address the opioid epidemic without significant new resources. That's why my colleague, Mr. Lujan, offered an amendment yesterday to the markup to provide $1 billion in mandatory new funding to address the opioid epidemic. That is also why we support authorizing the 2 new grant programs and expanding authorization of the existing grant today. Cut-go ties our hands and makes it very difficult for us to robustly support such important programs. It's clear that cut-go rules are harmful to us fulfilling our role as an authorizing committee, and it's time to eliminate those cut-go rules. And I'll yield back my time unless somebody else wants it. You want to talk, Ms. Tom?
I'll just follow up on it. Look, I think that this is a very important issue that Mr. Green is raising, and I'm not sure I understand all the ramifications of this Republican cut-go rule. It's in the Republican conference. It's not in the Senate rules, so they obviously don't go by it, and it's not in the House rules. But, I mean, it is ridiculous because essentially what is happening is we have, in this case, an opioid heroin crisis, and it's clear that this is something that, you know, maybe it's not completely unforeseen, but the epidemic proportion of it was certainly not foreseen a few years ago. And when we have to address it, we shouldn't have to cut other worthwhile programs to do it. You know, we've had discussions about programs for women and children, you know, all Ryan White. I mean, these are all things that are either similar epidemics or similar problems that need to be addressed, and we shouldn't be forced to cut one versus the other. The other thing I don't quite understand either is why this even is done in committee, because even if I decided I wanted to do a cut-go, I might want to cut defense or cut, you know, something that is not within the jurisdiction of the committee. And we seem to be forced, again, I don't know the details of this Republican conference rule, but we seem to be forced to even deal with other health programs as opposed to, say, energy programs or telecommunications programs. Again, I don't know the specifics of the, because this isn't our rule. But I think this effort to say that every time we want to do something to address a major crisis like opioids, we have to cut another health program for kids or another program for AIDS, or, you know, even limit it to this committee or even to the House as a whole. I mean, it just makes no sense. And I would urge my colleagues, I'm sure I'm not expecting anybody to listen to me, but I would urge my colleagues to take another look at this Republican conference rule, because it's going to make it impossible for us to deal with a lot of these public health crises, in my opinion. We need a lot more funding for this opioid crisis, and we're not really doing much at all here today in terms of the funding. I thank the gentleman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Our nation's opioid crisis has brought to the forefront the importance of investing meaningfully in public health and prevention, but it has also highlighted the artificial barriers that the House majority has imposed that make it almost impossible to address a crisis when it occurs or prevent one in the first place. And I'm speaking as well, specifically about the so-called cut-go rules. These rules are unsustainable at best, and while they cause great partisan arguments here in our committee, the real impact is felt in communities across the country who at this moment need assistance that never comes. By reducing authorizations for one program to authorize another, we're not saving the government any money, but what we are doing is hampering our ability to respond to a public health crisis. Each of our communities across this country is affected by the opioid epidemic. However, just because the opioid crisis is wreaking havoc doesn't mean that our efforts to address other critical issues like combating infant mortality, supporting children with health care needs, that these are no longer necessary. Similarly, just because the Zika virus is posing a real threat to the well-being of families across the southern portions of our country doesn't mean that the threat of other infectious diseases like Ebola don't need to be addressed. Swapping the funds of one program to support another is not an approach for success. But the rules we are dealing with in this case aren't about hard dollars and actual funding. They are about the ability to fund in the future, and this is really absurd. I think we need to stop pretending that it is possible or good policy to make this false choice between addressing one issue or another. When we do that, we don't do either well. I urge our colleagues to reconsider this arbitrary policy, abandon the cut-go soundbite, and recommit to doing all we can to help our communities who are in crisis. And I can yield the balance of my time. Yes, I yield to Mr. Welch.
Thank you. One of the frustrations I have about this situation is that there's a lot of objectives that we share. We want to do something about opioids. We've had a lot of common ground on energy efficiency. We have wanted to provide some relief to displaced coal country workers, just to name a couple. And we've got a committee that I think has bipartisan leadership. Our chairman has really made an effort to do things. But we don't have a way of addressing the legitimate concern about getting our fiscal house in order with attending to very immediate and real challenges that we face in all of our districts. I mean, this opioid crisis is a really good example. This is just a tragedy that's happening across the country, and it has nothing to do with whether you're in a Republican or Democratic district. It's a legitimate concern. We had pay-go when the Democrats were the majority. We had to pay for whatever it is we were proposing, either by an offsetting cut or new revenue. You've got cut-go. But what we don't have is any way where this committee that has a common objective, like addressing the opioid crisis, to actually wrestle with the tough challenges of how are we going to pay for it. There's a lot of areas where we probably could come up with some money for an offset. I mean, look at all the money that we're getting ripped off with prescription drug pricing that just is run amok. That's a favorite of mine. You may have some favorites of yours, but Mr. Chairman, if we don't have any way as a committee where we can address this fiscal issue to meet an objective that is broadly shared in this committee to address the opioid epidemic, then we are failing to do our jobs. And it's on all of us. It really is. So it's not as though there is a huge debate about whether we've got to try to bring our fiscal house in order. I mean, there is a huge debate about how to do it. But these arbitrary rules that give us an excuse so that we don't have to act and actually wade into the tough challenges is interfering with us being able to meet the concerns of the people that we're here to represent. I yield back.
Was the gentlelady's time from California? Did she yield back, or do you? Are there other members wishing to speak? The gentleman from Maryland.
Yeah, move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, I want to echo the comments that have been made, and I think they're being presented in a real bipartisan spirit. In other words, that this committee's ability to function effectively in responding to these crises that we've been talking about, particularly today, the discussion of the opioid crisis across the country, is certainly hamstringed by the current rule that's being described. And to put it in terms I think all of us can appreciate, I recently participated in a roundtable with about 50 professionals in my district. These were representatives of local and state government, substance abuse treatment providers, law enforcement, hospital personnel, and other healthcare professionals, all working diligently to try to respond in a coordinated way to the crisis, each of them digging deep to try to bring resources to the solution. And I just imagine members of this committee, both Republicans and Democrats, and members of Congress generally, sitting in these forums, which are going to be happening in every community across the country, and feeling that we're not able to maybe bring the same level of commitment in terms of resources that all the other partners around that table are trying to do. And that'll be a very tough position, I think, to be in. So I think it's certainly worth the discussion that we're having today about stepping back and looking at this particular constraint that's been placed on us by the rules of the House and this committee and so forth. And with that, I'd yield back.
Sorry, did the gentleman yield back? I'm sorry. Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? The gentleman from New Mexico has an amendment at the desk. Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3691, offered by Mr. Lujan.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Chairman Upton and Ranking Member Pallone, let me start by thanking you both for your efforts to address the nation's drug crisis and for advancing my legislation, the Improving Treatment for Pregnant and Postpartum Women's Act. Our nation continues to face a substance abuse crisis that is tearing apart communities and families. Unfortunately, too often there are too few resources and avenues for help. Certainly this is true in New Mexico, which is among the states most impacted by the epidemic plaguing our country. Too many people are suffering and too many people are being shut out from access to help. We must do more, including making the necessary investments to get people the care they need. But beyond the lack of necessary funding, some of our efforts are just outdated or need to be looked at and improved upon. And that is what my bill does. It updates existing law by creating a demonstration project in the existing pregnant and postpartum grant program to allow grants to be used for non-residential care. While residential care might be the right fit for some patients, it isn't necessarily the right fit for every patient. In my home state of New Mexico, there are far too few residential programs to serve the needs of my constituents. In addition, many of the existing facilities have wait lists, and with New Mexico's vastness, residential facilities are out of reach for too many. Today I'm offering a technical amendment that is meant to ensure that the important pilot program in my bill does not harm existing residential treatment programs. It does this by limiting the demonstration project from kicking in unless we increase funding for this program above 2016 levels. Now, to be honest, I believe that the amendment shouldn't be necessary. As originally written, my bill contained an authorization of $40 million, significantly above the current level to avoid any cuts to existing residential programs. Again, I agree that we do not want to do anything that would harm existing residential programs, but flat funding for this program is deeply troubling. Supporting residential facilities is critical, but so too is supporting innovation to make treatment available in non-residential settings, and both will require significant investments. I ask for support for this amendment and ask my colleagues if they'll join me in ensuring that we robustly fund the program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Mexico. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Further amendments to the bill? Seeing none. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 3691 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Two additional things. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the committee today, so ordered. Also want to tell our assistant clerk, Elizabeth, when we have votes on the floor, you find me and you get an ice cream cone coming from the cloakroom, okay? Yeah, wait.
Mr. Luan's amendment was designated as that as the topic.
Yeah, I would also just note that the amendment offered by Mr. Lujan is noted as FCD AMD-01XML. And the chair will recognize a gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I'm giving notice of our intention to file minority views for inclusion in any legislative reports that this committee forwards to the House on those measures we've considered. Under that rule, the minority is accorded up to 2 additional calendar days to file its views with the committee clerk. Again, thank you, and I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.